After a productive break, it's always difficult to get the attention of the audience again, although we didn't fill our stomachs. It is my great pleasure to moderate the next panel. I will do it very similar to Professor Ying. I will let each of the panelists introduce themselves. I have noted that during last panel, the audience almost didn't get enough time to ask questions. I have noted that some of the topics were not easily to be taken care of. And I have also noted that some of the topics have led over into the topic of this panel. This panel, we want to deal with the economic interdependence and the growing mutual suspicion in the trade system. We all have heard the adage of the growing trade war. We have heard, or we have seen technological disruptions taking place. And we have seen that this change in the flux of the world powers seems to start to affect the trade relationships between the various countries. At the forefront, I think we see the leading nation of today's world, which is probably, without any doubt, currently the US, is fighting for its turf by trying to implement or trying to force one of the threatening forces of the world into their style of cooperation. We don't know where this will lead to, but we do see that in this interdependence of global supply chains, there are certain disruptions to be felt. And when we see, for example, the little things that are happening to the current CFO of Huawei, one of the largest Chinese companies, then we do see what this can lead to. We all know in Switzerland we had similar mishaps with the US when our banking system was seen to be rogue. And in that entire period, we didn't have any senior managers being incarcerated, although you could have easily, by using the legal system of the world, you could have easily snap up, I don't know, the chairman of Credit Suisse on a trip to Italy and have him delivered to the US. But it didn't happen. Although the Swiss system then was considered rogue. This did now happen to somebody important in China. Let's see what this will lead to. There are other things that show that the world is not as cozy as it used to be. And these are all signs of, let's call it, growing nationalism in trade, growing nationalism in almost everything that you look at. We heard this morning the phrase, "Make Europe strong again." At least we heard "Make Europe strong again," which is a multilateral entity or a supranational entity. And I would hope Europe would get strong again. I know that you could easily hear on the streets of Switzerland, "Make Switzerland strong again." I don't know whether this leads into the right direction, but it's part of what we can discuss at a conference like today. And without further ado, I want to now give the word over to my panel. And we start with Professor Florin Baeriswyl, who is actually in today's forum something like the representative of art and culture. He's not just hardcore business, and he's not just hardcore academic. He is in the design world and in the world of brands and art-related things. I give you the floor, Florin, and please go through your brag list and show us who you are.
Thank you so much. Urs, thank you so much. Dear ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, happy to be here. It's a very exclusive little audience. So the students are the future. I'm a professor in Shanghai for branding, so I'm used to have an audience of 400 people. And here in Switzerland, that's the difference between China and Switzerland. It's just like an elite, very few people. So I will talk a little bit about my experience, what is different, what's same, but different. Me coming from education in terms of software engineering, so that was my right brain part, and the left, what you said, Urs, the creative part came from design and architecture. So I'm used to analyze, research, and also to have a creative interpretation out of this research. And I always look in the future, never back. So that's already written in the Bible, never look back. And that's what China does. We here in Europe, we always talk about our history, what we did, where we are strong in, but it's all about the future. So through the fact that I was never employed, I had to fight my whole life. I never got a salary. I have to earn my money myself, so I built up a company directly after the studies in terms of design, corporate identity and corporate design in '87. So brand was not yet a word. At the time, design was brand. So Lucky Strike with the logo, that was one of the first kind of awarded logo in the past. So nowadays, it's all about brands. It's not anymore about design. Design is a convenience. It's the brand is value. The brand is a nimbus, it's an atmosphere. So when you walk into a H&M or in a Hermes store, the atmosphere is different. So what is the atmosphere? It's untouchable. Untouchable. So I had last week a speech at the WEF about education in China, and I learned from many of these international leaders when I asked, what is a brand? There were very funny answers. Nobody really knows what is a brand. That's why let me explain you in short. So tonight when you come home, you can explain very easily in 1 minute what is a brand about, and your friend, husband, lover, whatever, will understand. So let me use these tools. So a brand, actually very simply explained, is like a tree. So a tree has a stem, has branches, and has leaves, and maybe even fruits. So if the tree looks green or colorful through flowers or fruits, then the tree looks healthy. And people say, so nice, so beautiful, the tree. But underneath, there are roots, many roots. So branding is not about the tree is the marketing. So the branding is about the roots. So how healthy are these roots reflects on the result. How attractive is the tree? So branding is cultivating. Cultivating means giving water to the roots. And this is valid for every situation, for every company, for every institution, even for the government. So branding means the true value, what you create, is actually the healthiness of the culture in your company, in your family, with your kids, or in education. So this is very simply, shortly explained. The brand has a personality. Every tree has a personality. And so it's basically, it's very, very simple what I try to explain in China to the students, because the students are the future. Mrs. Ying said, education is key. I fully agree. I changed my business mentality into an education mentality, and I learned a lot in China. So, for instance, what is different between Europe, the Western, and the Eastern world? We don't really have to say Europe, but the East and West difference is very important. And to make successful business in China, to cash in, to have like results, means to understand the culture. We can't, from our side, from Europe, say we know how it works, and then the Chinese should believe that we know how it works. So for me, it was truly difficult, because I was asked to create a curriculum, to write a curriculum for a new education in China for brand strategy and management. So the strategy is where to go, manage, how to create value. This is brand new. I teamed up with a professor lady professor from Fribourg in marketing, and I teamed up with a professor from Geneva in finance, because branding has the rational part and the emotional part. So therefore, this first degree, what we created in China, is unique. Now the question was, how do I set the criteria for application? I asked the applicants to make a video for 1 minute. 1 minute, 4 questions, to answer 4 questions. First question is, who are you? In 15 seconds. Second, what do you do best? Third, what do you like most? Why do you apply? I did the same here in Switzerland. It's very difficult that somebody could answer a question in 15 seconds. So these little videos, 1 minute, are artworks, because you can immediately see the personality, because the students in China, as you said, very disciplined, they really are strict to what, and the outcome is maybe so different. One had his teddy bear on the bed and say, you know, I grew up in a very nice family. Me, it's being part of this family. Then what can I do best? And others, the daddy paid maybe 30,000 US, and the girl was in front of the blue screen and looking very professional. But it's not about this. It's about the passion. It's about how the students bring themselves into this little grid of this 1 minute. So here in Europe, it's more individualism. We believe we know everything better. The students, they say, well, you know, me, I'm individual. It's in a way this individuality in the democracy where the leadership is missing. So parents, they delegate education to the universities or to the schools. In China, parents are very strict with the kids. The kids, they also care for the parents. The parents don't go to an elderly home. So the kids, I have a studio manager in Shanghai. He worked for Julius Baer for Swiss Re. He was 12 years in Switzerland. Then he said, Florin, I want to come to work with you. And I need to go back to Shanghai because my parents are 80 years old. They need me. So it's responsibility. So education is very, very important. That's the reason why I'm there. So through this education, I got in touch with the government as a professor being employed, first time in my life, as a government employee. And so I had the chance to also consult the CPC, industry related to the government. For instance, I did the brand for Zhejiang. I'm involved in the Shanghai branding. So just a short thing, what is different. In Zhejiang, that's a huge province. It's one of the richest provinces in China. Hangzhou is the capital. So they have a long history, very successful history. So say, you know, we need to attract international companies. Professor, how can we do this? How can we be attractive? So we said, well, it's the tree. It's very simple. Who are you? We have to understand the DNA, because brand is built on 3 things: truth, quality, and consistency. So these 3 elements are in China not really the guidelines. Truth, oh, so-so. Quality, no, big money. Fast, quick, consistency, no, we change immediately. Tomorrow it's a change. So through the three things, the government understood from Zhejiang where to go. So in 6 months, we created a new brand. The brand is, we make it happen, because it's the responsibility of the government to actually lead. It's a leadership to show the industry, the investors, the shareholders, stakeholders, and through what? It's a qualification system. So through the qualification, we have the elite, the best of the best, and this is the showcase. So this brand is only understood if you can translate this also in a Chinese meaning. So it's never just like the European or international perspective. So we have to understand the culture, and we have to understand how do you translate our wishes, our business approach, our strategy, our belief, our education into a Chinese context. That's what I see is one of the most challenging part, how to translate values from international perspective to an Asian perspective. So I could follow up with many other examples. I will be happy to answer questions. I don't want to be too long, because in branding you say short, sharp, focused. That's how it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Florin. Before I go to the next panelist, allow me one question. When I look at China, then China seems to be incredibly apt to communicate with its people, because I think nobody in China is really super critical about its leadership, other than what we see here in our country. So they seem to be able to have built an incredible brand in China with the internal communication. Now, the same cannot be said externally, because the world at large is afraid of China. We have all these communist fears. We think they might be imperial and want to, I don't know, do something to us or whatever. When you look at these fears that come out of these feelings of a looming trade war, then you think something went wrong in the branding. So what would you do in, let's say, 2 minutes to advise China how to build their brand strongly vis-à-vis the outside? What should they do? How should they change?
Well, it's a challenging question, but in fact, I would like to answer it very simple. So I was last October on a CPC event in Beijing. As I consult the government, I need to understand. That's why I got invited, because I pressured them, I pushed them to be there. I was very impressed, because they had like 3-4 videos about an interview. They interviewed people all over the world and said, may I ask you, what is the vision in your country? So in US, they said, vision? What do you mean by vision? In Europe, they say, no, we don't know what is Switzerland standing for? Whatever. So in China, everyone knows what is the vision of the government. How to move people from poor to a certain lifestyle. How to achieve the problems in future and nowadays with the environment. So these are really strong statements. And even the leaders, they go and plant trees to showcase the importance. So the air got amazingly improved in the last year. So every Chinese is proud. Every Chinese is proud of his country. Every Chinese, if he could, he would leave the country. Why? If he is rich, he want to leave. Then he believes there is maybe a better life somewhere else. He can even make a big business, like in Germany, in Switzerland. And then he would also want to go back, because it's the Chinese identity, the country with its leadership has a fascinating to everybody. But As it is a strong leadership, everybody wants to escape. The difference here is that everybody is individual, so pulls his own rope and always saying no. No. In every votation, if my neighbor wants to build a house, I say no. Give me money, then I say maybe yes. So it's, you know, in China, everybody pulls the same rope. And that means they can move tons. If we all together have the same idea, we can move many heavy things. And this is the differentiation.
So you're saying if we can convince the Chinese to also communicate better to the outside, they will be able to do that?
No. For instance, One Belt, One Road, for instance, 2025, the policy of China is we don't talk about, we just do it. Why should we talk about? Because it's a confrontation. We don't want to make people lose the face, the other governors, the other countries. So we don't talk about, but we do it. And you know, the Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, is a fantastic thing. If we just would think, the Europeans, about how to get in touch on this amazing structure, what they build, how to be innovative, you know, to have new banking facilities through apps where you can invest only $5, not 5 million and, you know, due diligence and say, where is the money from? So very simple new things, being creative, innovative. We could match this Silk Road, which is prepared from the Chinese, but we say, we are scared. What shall we do? So I believe it's not about communication. The communication is slowing down in China to the outside. China uses the pressure from the trade war to make their own people fit, also the government fit. It's not that they say, you know, we are under pressure. The governors, the leaders, they say, shit, we are under pressure, so you have to work harder. All you know, get up and cash in, work. So this is the message. So they use very intelligently the pressure, and you know, they are relaxed because they will find an easy way how to negotiate this trade situation. It will be not a war, it's not a trade war, it's a trade agreement, but we believe it's a war, because we want to believe this. And people here in Switzerland, they are scared about many things. As mentioned today, somebody, we are living in a welfare situation. We don't take decision. We always ask our employees, what the leader asks, what shall I do? What would you like me to do? So the employees, they tell about politics, what they believe the leader would think of what they should say. In China, it's different. So young leaders, we have 28-year-old, 30-year-old people in a leading position. Here, we, like, you know, 50, 60, we still fight to be in front. No young people coming through. That's why it's a pity there are no students here. So in a way, this cultural difference is not about scare, it's about the platform, how we can learn a lot.
Thank you, Florin, which means China is just taking a cold shower in order to get stronger. Thank you. With this, I want to, well, let's give him a hand, first of all. With this, I want to move over to the next panelist, Dr. Christian Etter, who was partly introduced in the morning whilst he was asking a question. He was heavily involved in the negotiations of the free trade agreement between Switzerland and China, which is hailed, of course, in Switzerland as the cornerstone of what we call a special relationship between our little country and that very big country. And to a certain extent, we are very proud to have him here, and we are very proud as a little nation to have achieved such a goal as negotiating something sensible with a giant like China. And without further ado, I want to give the word to Christian Etter. Please tell us what you think about this.
Thank you very much. First, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thanks, Ms. Möckli, for organizing this and everybody who was involved. I think events like these are important. We all have a lot to learn from each other. Maybe to my background, thank you for introducing me. I'm an economist by training. I also studied some international public law and constitutional law. I was a member of the executive board of SECO. I left government services almost exactly a year ago. I retired from government, and now I'm doing things like these and whatever I enjoy to do. I was indeed in the last 15 years involved in Swiss free trade negotiations. The last big chunk indeed was the free trade agreement with China, where I had the honor to head the Swiss delegation. Previously, I negotiated again with a team free trade agreements with the Republic of Korea, with Singapore, with Hong Kong, China, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, with Canada, Egypt, and some more. I was also involved in negotiations, early stages with Japan and Singapore. So that's my main background to the issue of today. I mean, the title of our panel is Interdependence and Mutual Suspicion. I rather disregard the second line about the trade war. I also don't see it as a war. I mean, war is something very serious, and we should not use this term lightly. I mean, we have to recognize that governments, even the big players, are still talking to each other. We have even had some successes in the negotiations in the recent time, like the CETA agreement between the EU and Canada, like the TPP, which minus the US was concluded, and I think will be a big success. Then there is the USMCA between US, Mexico, Canada, which was renewed recently. I'm not sure whether it's really improvement, but still they have actively worked on that. But then I, of course, also observed that the rate of disputes has increased in the last 2 years. And probably the main reason is the bombastic power play attitude of the recent US presidency, I mean, which is, of course, also a lot of talk, fair enough, branding maybe, I don't know whether beneficial or not, remains to be seen. And then if one party starts these games, the others have to reciprocate. This is also co-branding maybe, I don't know. The sad thing about this is that, I mean, as long as it stays in the talking and the bombastic etiquettes and whatever, but there is, of course, a risk that the gains of trade will be lost if there's a deterioration, if there is a race to the bottom, so to speak, undoing trade liberalization we had in the last decades. And I think nobody doubts that this trade liberalization, globalization, however you want to call it, has produced tremendous benefits on win-win basis, mostly. Of course, there are always also groups that are left behind, but even the left behind probably do much better than they did 30 years ago, whatever. So it is a big risk, and the hope, of course, is that everyone stays reasonable and really caters to its best own interest. I mean, the best own interest, of course, is to recognize that this economic nationalism in the end is a lose-lose game. I mean, it is a short-term illusion at best, because the others won't stay calm and reciprocate. So in the end, everybody is losing, and I mean, the hope is that the people in charge recognize this, and especially if they boast themselves to be deal makers, they shoot the right deals, of course. So let's be hopeful. And but then it's also clear that it's a bit theoretical just to relate to the gains of trade, to the ambition to maintain or improve competitiveness, and we all know competition in the end improves all sides or helps all sides, at least in the medium terms. But we cannot deny that at least some countries fear that they will be overtaken by others. I mean, it's not by coincidence that some countries are called emerging economies, and others are called maybe, I think we call ourselves still the industrialized world, even if we're way beyond this industrialization and our services economies, etc. But then I don't think you can fight this development, or it's futile. I mean, you have to recognize the fundamentals. I mean, size matters, the size of a country, the population. Of course, only if it's combined with development, with investment, in particular also in human capital. But if these forces are at work, I mean, 1.3 billion is there. And they're growing fast, as we have learned earlier this morning. The big asset the Chinese population has, and China also has a system, I think, that they are keen and capable of learning. I mean, I made this experience personally. I mean, you seldom find people who are as eager to learn and to receive, not showing false pride to think they know everything better. I mean, I'm Swiss, and I know that some of my fellow countrymen often think we know better and even better alone, which in my view is another of the big illusions of the present time. But anyway, these are facts of life, so you should not fight what you cannot win sustainably. What is the solution? And I stop at that for a moment. The solution is cooperation. I mean, you have to cooperate. There is no way other than that, be it science, technology, also continue to cooperate on continuing liberalizing trade. I mean, of course, it would be ideal if that could be done on a multilateral level. WTO, we all know that this has become very difficult. But if that's not feasible, or only feasible to a limited degree, then at least what should be done is on a regional or bilateral level. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there are developments, but there is, on the other hand, this power play, which recently has become a bit dominating. Let's hope that it will bear fruit in a constructive way, leading to more cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Allow me to take up one point, I want to take up 2 points, but you were saying economic nationalism is a typical lose-lose. Of course, the world only wants to talk about win-wins, but now for a time we start to talk about lose-lose. When I look at who loses, then I see it's the individuals in a nation that will lose as a whole, the people in a nation that will lose. But when I think about it, the politicians that are driving these policies, they might not necessarily lose because they just want to be re-elected. How do you see that dilemma, and how can we deal with this dilemma, in particular in the Western world that is so dependent on being re-elected?
I mean, it's a true dilemma. When I said lose-lose versus win-win, I of course was looking at the macro level.
Yeah.
Economies as such. I mean, then what drives the policy? The policy is driven by individuals. Of course, there are structures surrounding them and shaping their behavior. Of course, as an economist, I have to recognize that everybody is trying to maximize his own objectives, whatever they are. For politicians, certainly to be re-elected or stay in power is not only in democracies, but also in China, certainly a prime objective. This is very clear. I mean, the art, risking to become a bit philosophical now, the art of humankind to produce, to make progress is to shape political institutions such that these personal ambitions in the end lead to macroeconomic win-wins. And of course there are ups and downs. I mean, looking at history, not all periods were really great. I mean, in the present time there are also better and worse examples, of course. But this is the only thing. We should try to shape institutions such that the individual ambitions of the decision takers in the end will be beneficial to the public at large. But it's not a given. It's not a given, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Etter. I will leave my second question to the round of questions afterwards, and want to lead over to our next panelist, Joe Bossano, who is the former Chief Minister of Gibraltar, and as such is in the middle of one of these developments that we see in Europe, where nationalism seems to grow over supranationalisms, because I think Gibraltar will be having to follow the way of something that follows Brexit, and Brexit being what it is, I think it is probably very close to being the ideal case study for a lose-lose. I think Europe will lose, and England will lose, and it was, I don't know, the figment of imagination of some high-powered politicians that drove the car into the swamp, and in the swamp we are. Now, without further ado, Sir Bossano, please let us know what you want to say.
Thank you. Perhaps I can just say something about myself, to introduce myself on the basis that I think when we analyze things, we tend to see it through the lens of the lives that we've lived. And therefore, the picture that I would paint would reflect what I've done in my life. And you would understand it if I tell you a bit about that. I went as an immigrant worker to East London, and lived in East London and was a merchant seaman for many years. Then I studied in the University of London. I came back with an economics degree. I'm a socialist. I started the Socialist Party in Gibraltar. It is now the biggest and the oldest party. I led the trade union movement for 25 years in Gibraltar and forced the British government to pay native workers the same wages as UK workers. There was a disparity of 40% in our wages. The only time I've been defeated, but it took me 4 years. And I have stood for Parliament. I'm being re-elected 12 times, and I will be standing again. I'm 80 this year. I will be standing again in October this year. And when Her Majesty granted me with the knighthood this year. I'm not sure why she did it, but I suppose it's just that I've been around for so long, they felt they had to do it. But when my own people gave me the freedom of the city of Gibraltar to honor me, I said, well, look, I am a fighter, freedom fighter. And I fought all my life since the age of 25 for Gibraltar and for its people. So that is what I've done with my life, and where I analyze the rest of the world, I analyze it through the eyes of somebody that is what I've just described. I don't think we've got a trade war because it is something that is a development that is happening in the world, any more than we've got Brexit because it is a development that is happening in the world. But when Trump got elected, it was after every expert had said he wouldn't be selected as a candidate. Every expert then said he wouldn't get elected. And then every expert said that he wouldn't try and do the things he had said in the campaign, for example, building the Mexican wall. And all the experts were wrong on all three things. Now, maybe part of the problem with the experts is that we're all aware that there is climate change, and that the change is a change in the physical movement of the planet in temperature and so forth. But I think there's also a climate change in human society. That is to say, a change of the same order in terms of it being systemic. That is, changing the kind of civilization which I suppose began in the Mediterranean with the Greeks and the Romans, and the one that produces the values that we believe are the best values for mankind and we all defend. But there are many things, I think, that we tend to think have been there all the time and will always be there all the time because we've got short lives. I think if we take a longer lifespan, well, look, nationalism has been around much longer than the absence of nationalism. I think nationalism is natural because in Gibraltar we've got we're the only country in Europe that has got wild macaques, Barbary macaques, which are native to Gibraltar. The cousins are on the other side of the Mediterranean in Africa. And their behavior is very similar to ours, because obviously we share 97% of the DNA. And they are very nationalistic. And when they have elections, the guy that loses the election walks off in a huff with his supporters and he starts a new national group. Humans, I think, are governed by a DNA code which is not peculiar and unique to humans. And it transmits in our actions, which we then try to reconcile with our philosophy. But the fact that the Brexit is a result of the people of the United Kingdom not wanting to be part of a supranational European state is because it's very difficult to do what the European Union is trying to do. The European Union is trying to make people Europeans and forget whether they're French or German or British or Gibraltarian. Look, the union with Scotland happened in 1776. The Scots haven't yet got used to it. And I think we need to, that is part of our human nature. You know, I am part of the species. I'm also part of Europe. I'm also part of the concept of being part of the British Commonwealth. But I am Gibraltarian. And being Gibraltarian is something that gives me my identity. And when the first speaker was talking about branding, well, that's how I brand myself. I am that brand. I am the Gibraltarian brand. I mean, I don't agree with everything that the speaker said about branding, because I think one thing is branding when you're trying to create an image which is positive from something negative, but of course branding in the capitalist system is, you know, selling you paracetamol and calling it Panadol and charging you more for it. And therefore, an element of branding is extracting value where value doesn't exist by making you think, for example, that this is not H2O, this is some special liquid that you pay more for. So the society that we built has been a success, but it hasn't been a success simply because we are very clever in Europe and in the United States, which really took over the dominance of the Western world from the United Kingdom. And I think what we're seeing is a trade war, partly because Trump won. That is to say, if Trump had lost the election, we wouldn't have a trade war. Right? And if the guy in the United Kingdom had not started UKIP, we wouldn't have Brexit. But why is it that Trump won, and why is it that UKIP nearly defeated Cameron? It is because political climate change is happening, and we're all concentrating in what is happening to the weather, and we're not concentrating on what's happening in our societies. I believe that the model that we have created post the Industrial Revolution, I believe that the fundamentals of economics need revisiting. The concepts have been there for a very long time, and they need revisiting. I think the advance of science and technology, which we are making strides at a pace that while we're talking in this room, already we're discovering things that we didn't know when the session started. That is not being translated into our ideas of our society and how we live. So the trade war can be put down to catalysts. Trump, the catalyst in the United States, UKIP, the catalyst in the United Kingdom. But the catalysts are there because there is a chemical reaction that the catalyst triggered. But the reaction had to be the potential for the trigger to work and be there. And because none of the experts have been conscious of this undercurrent of discontent in Western society, they thought the catalyst would not work. The people who were going against the system would not work. People from the system going against the system. I've been against the system all my life. There's no other place for me. But the people that have been the defenders of the system have now become the critics and led the rebellion against it and captured a popular support. And that phenomenon is what we need to understand. Because I think understanding the trade war, understanding the need to produce a result that is positive, as Dr. Etter suggested, the only solution is cooperation. The only way is cooperation. The only way is cooperation if the world is going to be in the future like it has been in the recent past. It hasn't always been in the longer past as it has been in the recent past. And we may have experienced in our Western civilization the best years in the years that have preceded this time. And the future may be worse than what we've known. And I believe that the debate has to be analytical to the degree that we tend to forget everything we believed until now and look at it as we were looking at a phenomenon happening in a change, and changing a place which is not the place that we come from. Understanding something that we are blind to because it is happening to us. And big changes in society, big changes are better understood with the benefit of hindsight. You know, when the people had the French Revolution, they just thought they were going to chop off a few heads and that would be the end of it. They didn't know they were going to change the entire Western world in the process and create a new set of values. So my take on this is that the analysis of what is happening can be superficial unless we look for the underlying causes. And therefore, we cannot cure it, assuming that nothing dramatic is happening. It will be trying to rescue something. I mean, I think my own judgment is, coming as I come philosophically from where I've been, is that the actual propeller of the change that is being imposed in the world system today is because Trump has been the only one to be willing to recognize that the bipolar world, which finished with the unipolar world and one hegemonic power, is now going to be challenged. And he's trying to stop the challenger from succeeding. I think he will fail, but that is what he's up to. And the United States still has enough power to persuade Western allies to follow his line, because they've got the political clout, the military clout, and the economic clout to do it. Obviously, we can't, we can only be an observer in this world scene. There's only 30,000 of us and 5 square kilometers. So, whatever else anybody does, I can tell the audience one thing, Mr. Chairman, that it is true that you say that the result of the Brexit will be that the UK will be a loser. I have predicted in my own country that if there is a hard Brexit in March, the UK will be in recession in September, and the EU will be in recession in September, and the economic growth of my country, which last year was 8.9, will be slowed down to maybe 4 or 5.
Thank you. Maybe one follow-up question, a quick one. You call it a political climate change, but the political climate change doesn't necessarily mean that it would be a system change. Is a political climate change enough, or does it need a system change? You were mentioning the post-industrial system needs to be revisiting. I had a discussion in the break with a gentleman over there that this system indeed needs a revisiting, but is a revisiting enough, or does it need more than just a revamp?
Look, the climate change in the weather is creating an opportunity for some species in the planet and a threat for others.
Okay,
The
good answer.
climate change in the system will be the same.
Okay, thank you very much. With this, I want to lead over to our last panelist, Dr. Karl Pilny, a gentleman who has just arrived this morning, as you saw, with a big suitcase full of books that he has written, I'm sure. He's touring to advertise his latest book that he has written. I will have a hard time to stop him once he starts talking, you will see. So I need all the strength from the audience to keep to stop his water flowing once he gets going. Without further ado, Karl, tell us what you know about this topic.
Well, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you very much, first of all, dear Urs, for having me and for organizing this impressive and very important and very timely conference, because as we heard from the other panelists, certainly times are changing. We live through turbulent times, and I think there are some really pressing issues which concern all of us. And before I speak a little bit about China, let me tell you where I'm coming from. I mean that literally, because I'm coming from Dresden, where I spoke to a group of about 350 SME-owning entrepreneurs and businessmen in Germany. Before that, on Tuesday, I was in Hamburg, where we inaugurated a new German business association concerning the Silk Road initiative. So, as I mentioned, I'm very happy to fill in later the panel on the Silk Road, and there are all kinds of juicy anecdotes I can tell you about political Berlin. You may say Berlin is far away and we are in Switzerland, but we are all in the same boat, I would dare say, especially in relation to China and Asia. And where do I come from metaphorically? Well, since about 20 years I'm writing and speaking about the dawn of the Asian century, a shift of paradigm, namely that the global epicenter moves back to where it used to be for almost 2,000 years, namely to Asia. And as Urs has just mentioned, I wrote a trilogy called The Asian Century 12 years ago. A trilogy, by the way, because Asia, of course, is very diverse, as you know. So I wrote 3 volumes, one on East Asia, one on Southeast Asia, one on South Asia. And a few weeks ago, I published the sequel to that called Asia 2030. And what I do in that book is, on the one hand, I revisit some of my forecasts from 12 years ago, and the rather worrying news is that most of my forecasts were actually becoming reality, but often much faster and much more dramatic than I thought. And then the second part of the book is looking into the next 12 years. And what I see there is, of course, very much linked to China, but not alone. And that's my first message. I think we in Europe have an unfortunate tendency to look for simple explanations for complex matters. So in the 1980s, it was all the fault of Japan. Japan was on the rise, conquering the world and so forth. I was living and working in Japan in these days, interesting days. I mean, the Nikkei went to 40,000. 1 square meter of Ginza was more expensive than the whole of the Seengemeinden, because I live in Küsnacht, so I mean, easy peasy. But now, as we all know, in the early 90s, Japan was down, then the little tigers came until 97, and now it's China. But again, I urge you to consider it's not only China we have to look at, it's also India, which is starting to grow faster than China, which has a much better demographic structure, a median age of 24.7 years, also 1.3 billion people. We talk about the ASEAN region, 650 million people, 10 states, and if you compare the EU with the ASEAN, I think these are some rather disappointing, not to say shocking, conclusions which you have to draw. So I think that's where I'm coming from. We have to look at the rise of Asia, which will turn our world upside down. Our current world is very much dominated by the United States, the Washington Consensus. I mean our institutions like World Bank and so forth, all the way down to our academic, political, cultural life. And this is about to change much faster than many people realize and much faster than many people would like to see. Think about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was successfully established by China against a lot of opposition from the United States. And this is not the end, this is just the beginning. I think we will see much more of that. We will see many more institutions being created by Asians, of course, often by China, but again, not by China alone. And that's why I think we have to take a very cautious and open stance, and first of all, to analyze our own deficits and shortcomings, because what I see often is a projection of our own, well, of our own default, blaming, for example, China. So when we talk about the Silk Road project, I often hear, oh, it's just a kind of evil Chinese plan for global dominance. And if someone tries to be smart, he says, yes, not only evil geopolitical dominance, but also they want to outsource their kind of surplus infrastructure. All that may be true, but let me give you my private view. My private view is the problem is not that the Chinese have such a plan or that the Chinese have a plan at all. The problem is that we don't have a plan. And that is going to be a bigger problem as we speak. And if you look at the EU, which I'm tempted to say which had, but I try to be diplomatic and say which has an historic opportunity, a window in time to play an important role to translate and to bridge between the superpower number one, the United States, and the up-and-coming future superpower, namely China, and Europe doesn't seem to be up to fill that big role. Simply too big shoes. Europe is kind of getting bogged down by nationalistic interests, by selfish interests. It's thinking too small, it's thinking too selfishly, and that is a big pity because, as you can put it, if you have two elephants either fighting or playing with each other, or even when they're friendly, whenever they sit down, they just, they break the grass, and Europe is going to be the grass or the lawn between the two elephants. So no matter what China and the United States are going to do, Europe is going to be bogged down anyway. And that is a pity because Europe could contribute a lot to that party, a lot of innovation. That's another important element of my book because I'm a very active business angel. I accepted a new professorship for innovation and so forth. So if you look at the recent changes, like China since 2 years is filing 1.3 million patents a year. That means it's number one. United States, second placed, just files, well, half of that, about 700,000. And this trend is going to intensify. So in Davos this year was very interesting. You had a lot of sessions on rise of techno-nationalism, and China is shaping e-commerce, and we all know about Alibaba. Everybody talks about the social credit system and the dangers and this and that. But what many people in Europe don't realize is that it's a big business opportunity, that the Chinese culture is quite different, and that, of course, this type of industrial policy which is taking place in China is not coming from nowhere. You could already see that in the twofold rise of Japan, first between 1860s and 1910, second between 1945 and 1964, then it was replicated by South Korea in the 80s, and now it's China. But I dare say there is a lot of East Asian Confucianist DNA involved, and a lot of global parameters and elements, and that's what we have to analyze. So it's a complex, multipolar world out there. In 2030, 4 of the 5 richest and most powerful nations of the world will be from Asia. So it will not only be China we have to look at. We have to look at the whole of Asia in a very holistic fashion. And that's, to come to the end now, what I've been doing in the last 20 years, and that's why at the moment I do a lot of public speaking, of course, because people are getting more and more worried, oh, Chinese shopping tour, you know, they want to toughen or make certain technology transfer laws more strict and so forth. But like in many ways, you're just trying to fight the symptoms, but not the underlying causes. As you very amply put it, I think, Trump, to be a bit provocative, is not the cause. He may not even be the catalyst. Trump is a symptom, and there are many other symptoms out there, and that's what we should be looking at. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Karl, not that I want to make you give us another 20-minute speak, but outline to me quickly. You said the problem is not that China has a plan, the problem is that the rest of the world doesn't have a plan. Can you quickly tell me your plan for Europe?
I wish I would know. I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think, that only if Europe integrates further that it has a chance to stand up against number one and number two. I mean, the Americans call this Thucydides trap, as you know. So, and they always say, in the last 500 years, there was almost always a war when number two wanted to have a place in the sun. Think about Germany and the Great Britain and so forth. So clearly Europe only has a chance if it's, to say an absolute taboo word now, a no-no, if it's having a sound industrial policy to begin with. It's banal, but you can forget the whole e-mobility boom if you are taken hostage by Asian battery producers. And it's not a coincidence that the three leading companies are Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, you know, producing lithium-ion accus. And so in many important and strategic areas like artificial intelligence and so forth, Europe is not getting its act together. This cannot be substituted by national initiatives. I mean, they may be laudable. Last night I earned a lot of jokes and laughter when I said, well, look, Germany is earmarking 3 billion euros for a grand artificial intelligence strategy. And I laughed almost and said, well, better late than never, better little than nothing. But if you think that the city of Shanghai alone is spending something like 20 billion a year and China 170 billion, I think the 3 billion from the German government are pretty cute. But as I said, better late than never, and better little than nothing. So that's what we need. We need a kind of strategic outlook on our environment. We need a strategic industrial policy. We need further integration. In, if you want to put it maliciously, Europe is stuck halfway. I mean, it's neither fish nor flesh. I spent several years in Brussels in the 90s. There are a lot of inefficiencies and so forth. So we have to really come to terms. Do we want to go further? Then we need some painful reforms, or we go one step back. That's another possibility. That's pretty much the Brexit scenario. But the way it is right now, I do not think it's sustainable in the next 3 to 5 years. And unfortunately, it's exactly these 3 or 5 years where we will see fundamental and dramatic changes which are irrevocable in many ways.
Thank you, Karl. With this, I quickly want to open the floor, and you may have noted that officially we have only 10 minutes, but I decided in my head, officially we have about 30 minutes, and we have less time to eat. And if anyone is against that, please let me know. So feel comfortable saying you have a question, and I think you have to wait until you get the microphone.
Thanks, very interesting session. Was question for Dr. Etter. There was a meeting in Davos between President Jinping in Switzerland, and it was about the upgrade of the free trade agreement that was originally signed. So there was another agreement that was signed. What is this all about? I mean, a free trade agreement had been implemented. And what is the purpose of this so-called upgrade? Second question is just not really a question, a comment that even Brexit has an impact, since we're dealing with global issues, on the global supply chain, because that is now affecting medical device imports into Australia. 90% of all Australian medical device imports. So basically we're living in an interlocked world, never mind going to supply chains, and China is very much a big part of this whole conundrum. So there will be mega shifts in the whole way, the entire value chain in the next couple of years in a whole range of industries. And this so-called trade friction continues. And I'm afraid that politicians don't really understand the depth of this, and the populist society will rise because of this conundrum.
Thank you. Well, this issue about the update of the Switzerland-China Free Trade Agreement, I mean, the purpose is, from a Swiss perspective, first and foremost, to complete the tariff elimination. I mean, 95% of the tariffs will be down to zero or down substantially, reduced by 60% or so in the next few years. I mean, a large portion already is down at zero. We heard it this morning. Those products which are subject to a 10 or 12-year reduction period are now at half. I mean, we're in year 6, as was been correctly mentioned this morning. But there are still a few tariffs left which are not subject to dismantling. And these are, I mean, you can look this up because the tariff schedule is public, of course. This is a rather interesting or strange mix of products, some machine tool here, some chemical there, some, I don't know, food product here. I mean, it's normal in all negotiations, the specific sensitivities, which if you want to conclude in time, you have to say, we'll do that later. So the purpose is basically that. Of course, there are also is room for improvement in trading services, in investment, in other areas. And the agreement is that the two sides will look at this sort of as a package. And I'm, since 1 year, as I mentioned, I'm not in it anymore directly or even indirectly. Progress has been relatively slow, but then we have to recognize until we came to the stage of negotiating the original agreement, which then took 2 years and a few months. This was more or less 4 years just to shape the things, to identify interest priorities and also establish mutual understanding and trust and things like that. So it's not really surprising that even for this update, even if it's a limited area or a limited set of areas, will also take some time. But personally, I hope, of course, that this can be done in a foreseeable future.
Thank you. More questions? Over there.
Thank you. I'd like to ask kind of anyone in the panel really about the propensity of Western countries, but predominantly America, to use economic sanctions as a form of policy to achieve political outcomes. And it seems to be something that is done more actively by Western countries. And if we are going to hope for a cooperation, don't you think that this type of aggressive policy should be revisited?
I can quickly say something to that, and then I hope some of the panelists will say something to that. I believe it used to be that the US thought globalism, or globalization, not globalism. Globalization is something that benefits everyone, in particular also the US. And they used globalization as a tool to tie in other nations, in particular other rogue nations that they wanted to entice into joining, let's call it the global dance floor or whatever. And maybe the entry of China into the WTO was one of the big success stories, so to speak, for the US and that policy. Now, of course, the climate has changed, to put it in Sir Bossano's words. And with the climate change, I think we have to get used to unusual means that so, how do I puzzle us or puzzle me as a person? I just want to do business. I want to do business in China. I want to do business in the US. I want to do business everywhere. And all of a sudden, I see somebody behaving like the US, and I don't understand the world anymore. And this is probably one of the main topics of our forum. We see mechanisms happening that we cannot really relate to because they change all the paradigms that we had in our head that were part of our old system. Let's call it the old system. And I do not know where it leads to. My personal thinking is it's not the right tools, but maybe it is. And I think we will find out, and maybe we will find out what the future will bring, but possibly we will also find out that the future will not be as prosperous as we had it in the last few years before this mess started. So my answer is I don't have an answer. I notice the same that you do, and I am looking at it with amazement, but possibly someone in the panel has an answer.
Well, I think there's two things that we need to bear in mind. One is that, of course, the only people who can effectively impose sanctions are the people who want to stop selling something that people want to buy. So the capacity to do it is determined by the dominant position in the market. Because if you don't sell something and there are plenty of other suppliers, that it's meaningless. I think there's a level at which sanctions are very important, which is when it's agreed, for example, in the Security Council, and there is something where, in effect, the civilized world is saying uncivilized conduct has to be stopped, and better sanctions than, sending people to find wars of mass destruction that never existed, right? If we look, for example, at Korea, at the North Korea situation and the US sanctions, if Trump actually pulls off a less nuclearized Korea as a result, then it's difficult to criticize that. Mm-hmm. I think I agree with you that if it becomes something that is done too often and for too insignificant reasons, then it undermines the whole legitimacy of it.
I think we have, no, you have the microphone, so, oh, okay.
I mean, I think it's not quite connected to what you said before, but one of the things that my feeling is that too often we talk about trade as if we're absolutely convinced that more trade is always good. And I'm not convinced that most governments in Asia, and I'm certainly not speaking just about China now, have that conception. I think quite often the question is more power is good. and that trade helps towards power, and there's very clear concepts of comprehensive national power which look at economic power, military power, cultural power, etc. And these things have been developed over time. We get lots of writers in India writing about this, often ex-military people who are taking things from the Chinese Association of Social Sciences. And when we come back to what Professor Pilny was speaking about, the idea of strategy, if you have a clear concept of developing national power, then you start to have a strategy. And when we start to look back at that, I mean, this idea of the idea that for the last 20 years or so, or 30 years or so, everything was fine, we sometimes forget that actually part of China's growth wasn't just that this amazing visionary Deng Xiaoping suddenly opened the doors and everything happened. It was also that the leaders in the US and the UK were desperate to change their internal economies, and so they fought against their own workers to drive things abroad to lower costs. We've had these dynamics all of the time. And for 20, 30 years or so, it seemed to work quite well for most of the people in power. But for a lot of people now, they're starting to think this doesn't work so well. And we start to reach this point where there's more and more tension, there's more fear of a resurgent or more powerful or whatever we're going to call China's rise, re-emergence, resurgence. And other countries in Southeast Asia are concerned about that. And so we start to see the various things with the Quad and whatever else. And then we reach into this area of enormous kind of uncertainty. And exactly that time we have a US, and maybe some of us hope only for 4 years, but a US leader who clearly is not working to a US plan. He's working to his own plan. And if you listen to, if you listen to US diplomats, they say very clearly, we don't know what he's going to do when he goes into a room. So what I'd like to ask all of the panelists, certainly in the light of the Swiss-Asian Chamber of Commerce, is these tensions within East, Southeast, and East Asia, how do they impact China and Europe? Because that I find is a fascinating question.
Karl, can you take it up first?
Yes, with pleasure. No, first of all, thank you for your statement. I take the liberty to summarize it in the following way. I think we indeed need a new concept of power and a new concept of growth. Growth is more than just a quantitative addition, adding up produced cars and things like that. Power also entails soft power and some other elements. Same goes for growth. Growth for growth's sake. We see the climate change and a lot of other unwelcome changes. I think the impact of growth is a very important element. I was active in co-founding the Swiss Impact Investment Association in Zug, so that's why I have to speak that way. But the big problem, admittedly, is to quantify and to measure impact. But many people, many smart people are working on that. So I think that's very important to have new, broader, or better said, more holistic concepts of that, and then to have a look at what's happening in Asia. And you're absolutely right, it's always very important to look at the history. So the century-old tension between Japan and China and the upbuilding tension between India and China is relevant to all of us. First of all, you have a lot of nuclear powers around. Secondly, as I just said before, these are the most powerful and soon the largest economies in the world. I wouldn't go as far as saying the Third World War could start for some islands in the South China Sea, but close to that. So you have to look at Asia also in that regard, in a geopolitical way, and of course the Silk Road has to be looked that way as well. Central Asia is of central importance, as the name suggests. If you build the Kra Canal in Thailand, you have a new Panama Canal, which is making the Malacca Strait obsolete. So there are all kinds of interesting and important developments going on. Again, I'm speaking more for Germany than for Switzerland now. A lot of this is going by unnoticed and no one seems to care, but this is having a direct impact on us in Europe and in the so-called Western world. So again, we need urgently a more sophisticated foreign policy, which is taking into account all the elements I was mentioning there. And again, I think many Asian governments and societies are advanced in that regard. If you look at Make China 2025 or Make India, all these big master plans, which of course are very similar to what happened in Japan in the 80s when the almighty MITI had all these strategic plans, and I was working with the MITI on many of these concepts in the 1980s. So it's not rocket science, but you just have to have a certain strategic outlook, and you have to be flexible and adaptable enough, for example, to realize the importance of technological power. So what I said earlier, China is now numerically or quantitatively the biggest patent filer in the world. That in itself doesn't say anything about the quality. Unfortunately, also the quality is increasing dramatically. But that's what you have to look at. And as I said, many Asian nations are very smart. They are trying to do a quantum leap in new industries, biogenetic, biorobotic, look to the space missions, dark side of the moon, the Mars, e-commerce, artificial intelligence. And of course, there are many, many elements which they can profit from. They are protected by the government. They have access to data of 800 million people, and the people don't care very much about it. But the important thing is they put all that together and make it work. And in the Western hemisphere, especially in Europe, I don't see that. I see a lot of almost provincial, but at the very least naive, small fry thinking, defensive thinking, reactive thinking. We have to be much more active, proactive, and not only reactive, and so forth and so forth.
Yeah, I want to quickly answer also a little bit, you know, Asia as such, and the various nations in Asia, they used to fight quite healthy wars with one another. And, you know, the Burmas against the Thais and what have you. So, let's say around World War II, some nations decided it would be better to stop these wars and start trading with one another. And the creation of what is now called the Asian Noodle Bowl of agreement, you know, you don't know who has an agreement with whom, started to be negotiated. And that has led to ASEAN, to the Asian Economic Zone, and to all these various multilateral and bilateral agreements. These agreements are seen as one of the bases that the various nations should not end their wars and their foods, and instead trade. Now, I guess it's the same that happened in Europe. You know, we had the creation of Europe to tame Germany, so to say, and to bring Germany together with its foes and create a European nation. Ever since then, France and Germany embrace each other, or try to embrace each other. And England also played along for a while, as we saw. And the basis was always the thought, trade is better than lobbing bullets and bombs at each other. And possibly, you know, with your questions, you're saying, is trade always better, or is trade good in itself? Maybe that question is now being asked. And maybe we come to a solution that it is not always better. But I grew up in a world where I said to myself very firmly, trade is better than the alternative. And I don't see many other alternatives. And that's where I see the ultimate win-win in trade. But maybe I'm too one-dimensional in that.
Can
Yeah, please.
answer something? Well, trade was the past, because it was like, I sell you this pen. The future is different, and especially the European plan should be different, because teaching is listening to understand. If you understand what happens in the world, it's a monetized world. If I have the power to buy, then I buy, and then the other delivers. So that's what China does. China buys. They bought Syngenta, for instance. So why? Because the Swiss sold it. They could have kind of not a trade to sell it. They could do an intelligent trade to cooperate, what we said, cooperation, how to deal with intellectual property, how to license out, know how to share, but keep the the trigger in our country, in Europe or wherever. So now China has one of the favorite places in Basel for a real estate development. And how did China grow? Through real estate. So now Basel will be changed in future. So the Swiss say, the bloody Chinese. No, very smart. Chinese are just smarter, just more active, more alert. And instead of now complaining and being scared of trade war, actually be smart. For instance, you know, the ETH here in Zurich, they have amazing, innovative IP. No Swiss, no entrepreneur is willing to invest. Only the family of the students is invest to 100,000 to grow maybe the belief of this in their own son or daughter. So we have amazing startups, but no seeding money. In China, if a student of ours does have an idea, the government says, interesting, you get 5 years free a loft where you can develop your business. You get for 5 years no taxes. Huh? Because, and you get every year 1 million. But show us the plan. So this is a support, and the economy grows. Here in Switzerland, first day, you pay AHV, you pay social welfare, you pay taxes a lot. You can't even open a bank account because the bank says, no, 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 we don't believe. You know, it's just like amazing. So let's change these small little things, be intelligent. The European plan should be listening, understanding, and adapting the change, what you said. It's the change. The only consistency in life is the change. And we don't want to change.
Very, very true. Yes, please.
I'm trying to sort of steal a little bit of time from the rest of the audience. So my first, I really like the expression of a cold shower. So my sense is that China, in a way, is for us a cold shower. And we could use it to make ourselves fitter. That having said, what I'm hearing as well is a notion of let's look at the Chinese system and see if we can learn from it, which I think is fine. But at the same time, my position is if you try to win a game on the basis of the rules set by your competitor, even if you win that game, you still lose it because those were not your rules. I think it's very important to be aware of what your rules really are. So I represent AXA. We're an investment management firm, and what we do is we allocate capital. And my sense is that one of the things that we can do in the financial industry is to make sure that the rules that we have defined to allocate capital, meaning correct data, correct financial data, and correct data on impact. So the United Nations Development Goals, and those are not the European goals, those are actually universal goals. We can communicate those with the Chinese. And I think that if we start to put that communication in place with the Chinese, we potentially could develop a level playing field. And I think that a level playing field, let's not kid ourselves. The Chinese are using different rules than we do. And that's also how they win. It doesn't mean that we have to play according to their rules, because that's their system. Maybe we shouldn't want to win according to their system and according to their rules. So that's my statement. I have a question as well. I'm super curious to hear what your view, what you were really thinking when you were stating there are going to be structural changes and we cannot revoke them or we cannot turn them around. It almost sounded as if you sort of expect a few changes and that there's a little bit of drama around it. Yeah.
Well,
so what are those changes?
Well, the changes are manifold, if I may jump on that question. What I'm simply saying is that inevitably the change of gravity, of the center of gravity globally, is not going to only to change the macroeconomic environment, it also is changing cultural elements, structures of societies, also in military terms. That's what I mean by that it's really a tectonic shift. And of course, due to its speed and size, you have the occasional curly waves. That means a little stock bubble here, a little real estate bubble there. But the tectonic shift is dramatic. And because I deal a lot with the investment world as well. Some people call me, I'm a kind of mix of Urs Schöckli and Mark Faber, because I do a lot of products and structures in the investment world. And what I mean is, last year, for the first time, Hong Kong had more IPOs than New York, and that is going to continue. So what we have to look at is the underrepresentation of the increasing power of Asia in terms of market cap, in terms of everything else, and so forth. And as you know very well, you still have a very undercovered investment market in China. I mean, you have rudimentary social security system. That's why, of course, the China stock market is a bit volatile, because you have all this speculation going on. But that, of course, is going to be changed, because A and B and HS, everything is going to be blended together. What I'm saying is this will change the capital markets dramatically. I mean, look already now at the fixed income.
Let me react to this right now straight away. So I totally agree with you that China is underrepresented in the indices, for sure. So with so China, for people who are not working in the financial industry, you have like a global index for, let's say, emerging market equity index. China is like not at 40%, it's moving towards 40%. We have a global bond index, and China is probably going to be like 5%, which is weird if for the largest economy. But that having said, the fact that China is getting accepted in the indices is now taking place purely at technical reasons, like can you sell the stock, can you sell the bonds, can you convert it into cash within a certain time frame. But there's nothing around the data, the quality of the data that is being provided, etc. There's nothing around impact. And what I feel is that very large European institutional investors can make three choices. They either stay to their asset manager. I would love to have a portfolio, but please no China. Or they can state, I'll take the portfolio, but I'll take the index, and I have no view on China. Or they state, I'm willing to invest, but only under my conditions, which are correct financial data, correct data on CO2 emission, water intensity, and so forth. And if I'm not getting those data, I'm not going to invest. And what's happening as well is that very large institutional investors are now starting to speak with one another about it. And they would like to speak on group with China.
But sorry,
Can I quickly take it up, because I think your first comments were the most interesting. You said China will win, first of all. Is that so? And I want to put that in the room, and I think if we go for, either we answer it or we have some food for thought whilst we eat lunch. And then the next thing that you said was also interesting, that you say we play by their rules. I would like to ask any Chinese in the room what they think. No, I don't want to go into a personal debate now with you. I just want to put this in the room. It's always a question of perspective. Of course, if we want to do certain things in China, if I want to talk to Xi Jinping, I probably will have to play by his rules, because otherwise he will not talk to me. Same applies the other way around. If he comes here, maybe if he speaks with me, my rules will be not so high as his, but at least he will have to play by my rules. Question is, who wants to go where? And currently, as China is coming, let's say as China is coming to Europe or China coming to wherever, I think they have to play by our rules. Because if they, and initially our rules might be very soft, and they can, as we will hear in the afternoon, they could acquire any company in Germany. But Germany is changing. And there was a very famous case where Germany decided, no, they cannot acquire any company they want to. And so these rules are not made by China, I would say. Maybe we are reacting to them, but They're definitely not made by China, I would say. But I want to open it to the panel again, and then I think soon we have to go for lunch. Any comments from the panel to that? Does China win?
Yes,
And
I think that the first flaw in the argument is that it assumes that we are going to be, into the future, sufficiently powerful to be able to decide which rules apply. I think the possibility may be that, you know, the rule makers and the rule takers are a reflection of the balance of power. Mm. We think that the things that we do are the best way of doing everything because obviously we've been running the planet for quite a long time now. For other people, we've been telling them what to do in Africa, in South America, in Asia and everywhere else. But if, by definition, we have created a situation where philosophically we believe that there have to be underdeveloped nations have to be helped to develop. Emerging countries have to be helped to reach our standard of living and quality of life. Well, everything that we're doing to strengthen them carries with it the fact that, you know, a point in time will be reached when they challenge us. And I think that is inevitable. I mean, we created the situation, but that is how our civilization over thousands of years has changed, you know. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, and therefore, if the center of gravity moves to Asia, that will have political, cultural changes and changes what is the proper way to conduct business. Because the people who dominate the market will determine the rules.
Yes, and if I may interject very quickly, you can't really blame them because one thing I want to point out, it's certainly not China or the Asian countries which invented incorrect figures or double accounting. I mean, being European, I think we should keep the ball rather low, and WorldCom and company are also something. And let me be very provocative here. When it serves certain interests, then they all demand correct figures and this and that. But if it serves not their interests, then JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, UBS and everybody else is more than happy to play along and to cash in on some big Chinese banking IPO. So what I'm saying is everybody knows that Chinese figures are not very objective, but show me any figures which are objective. And the point is, as long as everybody agrees and plays along, it's fine. It's only if someone is feeling left out, then it becomes an issue. So I think we should be pretty balanced on that. And last point, I'm working since a few months on some SDG projects in China, including indexing and so forth. So there is a lot of stuff happening. Xi Jinping is really pushing green finance to the forefront of the agenda. And once again, Chinese are very quick and very adaptable. So there are many, many important changes in the pipeline.
And I think with that, I give the word to my co-organizer, and then I think we will wrap it up. It's good that it gets emotional.
No, wait a second, I have to say something. The rules are always universal rules in the world. It's only mattering of the perception of understanding of the rules. So in China, Chinese firms, Chinese people understanding European or international rules completely or a little bit different from Europeans see it. And I think another parameter we need to consider is what Florin mentioned about we just need to do it. Chinese just do it. And so when you are on the platform, you keep doing it till some moment your collaborator realizes that, wait a minute, this guy already become big. I have to consider the rule to incorporate this guy, but it's too late. So then this guy will become the partner of me to making the new rule. That is what is experiencing now. So what is a rule that in the future will be good for both sides, for the emerging party, for the established party? That is a question, and that needs lawyers, that needs politicians work together rather than only one party working alone. So if we don't have regulation, especially now it's a data era, we don't have a regulation, we don't have professional people who know about data, then that will be a disaster. How many lawyers in this room know about data? It's a data analyst. You're not, I know.
No secrets revealed here. Thank you. Thank you. I will leave it like that, and I think we will leave it in the room unless there is an urgent question. I would like to thank the panel. Before we break for lunch, please give them a big hand. Thank you. Ja, das ist